Everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CL 650.
And welcome back. I'm Tony Giaventu, your host. Dan Schmidt from Remdale Painting is in the studio, and Sat Harwood, a lawyer with Les Brands Mendez. We're talking about the major construction process, and we're talking about how strata corporations essentially protect themselves. So, so we've talked earlier on about when's the right time to do this. How do we know what the right time is? When do we schedule it? But the next big question I think that most stratas have is, how do we know what the cost is really going to be, and how do we find that? So, we've got a depreciation report, or we had an estimate a few years ago from someone that said repainting the building is going to cost us $150,000 as an example. And so we've got that number, but how do we really know what that number is? And I think, Sat, we had been talking earlier about what's the preferred option. Do you negotiate with a single contractor, or do you actually go out for tender and get bids from multiple contractors? And how do we control that process? So from your experience, maybe you can walk us through that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I think to a certain extent, how formal you make the process is really going to be dictated by the size of the job that you are putting out to the marketplace and the complexity of the project itself. So, on the more formal end is the tendering process. On the less formal end, you can negotiate with a single contractor, or perhaps one or two. There's a number of different options that you can go about. Obviously that there's always going to be a cost entailed in that. So if you're looking at what's really a small job, it doesn't make much sense to go the formal tendering route. At the same time, if you're looking at a job that's fairly straightforward, that isn't going to have a lot of sort of wild card elements to it, then having a process where you just negotiate directly with somebody probably makes a bit more sense.
Right.
So really, it's going to be dictated by those two variables, I think.
So the benefits, of course, of a tendering process is the strata corporation, and either through you as their legal representative, through a consultant, someone is going to set up a very specific scope of reference for this project. They're going to set up all the particulars of the details of the mechanics, the materials, if it's painting, preferred paint quality, time of construction. There'll be all the parameters of this construction project will basically be set out in the tender document. There will be some contract conditions that are set out in the tender document, and the strata can then go out and they can obtain bids from a variety of contractors. It doesn't necessarily mean it's less expensive. But the one benefit is everybody is now bidding on exactly the same thing. And so it's a way of a strata corporation having better control over what the variables of costs are going to be. And it's one of the things that's capable of doing when you actually have time to plan. That's one of the issues. If it's an urgent situation that we need to get the contract done in the next 3 months, you're probably not going to a tendering process. Right, you're going to probably find a contractor who you can negotiate with directly. But do you find it and maybe Dan, you can answer this too. Do you find there's any economic differences, whether it's a negotiated contract with a preferred contractor or whether you're actually going to a tendering process?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, the world of negotiated contracts in any large contract has gone away. And that's just a matter of, I think our society has moved to much more a formal process in large contract. I think that's ultimately good for the consumer, and I'm happy to participate in that. But I remember it's not that many years ago when a handshake agreement on a $50,000 or $60,000 project, because they preferred us, as it were. Now, unless you've done some historic work there, those are very, very rare. Unless they're, as you say, smaller contracts, maybe $10,000 or $12,000 or $20,000, that kind of thing. Certainly, the larger contract you mentioned, Tony, around $150,000, if it's a high-rise building that we're doing or something like that, that's going to have multiple bidders on it, and really should, to give the customer the best sense of it. You mentioned the tendering process, though, and there's a number of ways to go about that. But if I can weigh in from my perspective, we do a lot of restoration work and we do painting work. When we're looking at a contract and wanting to bid it, the clearer and cleaner the scope of work is defined, the more able I am to take any risk component out of my bid. The more I do that, the more aggressive I can be with my pricing, because I know exactly what I need to do, and I can price that exactly, and the customer is going to get exactly that. The more it's kind of, like an octopus with lots of, it's just unknown really all the components that are going in, or the scope hasn't been defined clearly. Maybe because just the owners kind of wrote it up themselves, or that kind of thing. The more risk there is that the project's going to need to have me do other things, and I need to build that in some way so that my contract covers that, and that can be costly to the customer.
Well, and we talk frequently, we were talking earlier about projects where it looked like it was the best price when you got a number of quotes, and then you find out at the end of the project it was in fact the most expensive price because the contractor basically nickeled and dimed us to death over extras, right? And because we didn't have a clear enough scope of contract in that relationship. But there are other liabilities in the tendering process it's not just the contract. It's not just putting the paint on the building. You deal from a legal perspective. We always recommend to a strata that's doing a contract of any significance, budget for some legal services before you sign the contract, before you go to the tender process, because you want to cover the other liabilities, such as.
Yeah, no. Some of the things that you'd want to be concerned about is. Maybe I can just back up for a second. Is when we think of a tender process and the call for tenders that goes out, we always think of it from the perspective of what's the construction scope of work. But there's also going to be a legal element to that, and that legal element, there's a number of risks that can arise in a tender process. The biggest risk is obviously that the losing contractors feel that the process was not conducted in a fair manner and bring a claim against the Strata Corporation. And that has happened in a few cases over the years in British Columbia. Some of the things that you can do from a legal standpoint to protect yourself, including things such as a privilege clause. Privilege clause is a clause that's going to allow the Strata Corporation to accept any bid that comes in. It doesn't have to accept the lowest bid. The advantage to that is obviously you may get a situation where the lowest bid comes in and it's from a contractor that you've heard is always going to be problematic, is always going to nickel and dime you on extras and things of that sort. So a privilege clause gives you some protection there. If you're looking at a discretion clause, what that essentially allows you to do is maybe you get a really good bid comes in, but it's not exactly compliant with the way that the package was sent out. Discretion clause allows you some leeway to look at accepting that sort of a clause. And the third one I think you always want to keep in mind is you want to have a clause in there that's going to limit damages in the event of a claim by one of the aggrieved bidders. The courts in this province have essentially said that if somebody is successful on one of these claims, they're entitled to their lost profits for the job. That can be quite a lot of money when you're looking at a big project such as the ones we've been talking about today. So one of the things that people will do is they'll include a clause that says any damages are limited to your time and money to prepare the bid package. So not your lost profits, just the time you spent getting here in the first place.
Well, and most consumers kind of perceive that their risk is based upon the fact that they've each paid a $7,000 special levy. What they haven't considered is we are 350 units, and this is in fact a $5 million contract. Right? And this $5 million contract has some significant impact on things like risk and profit and cost overruns and all of the other variables that can occur within those contracts. Here's the other question we get in a lot of emails from people, and I've certainly seen some this week, and it's kind of the catch-22 I think that comes up in the tendering process. If the Strata Corporation doesn't have the money in their reserves to be able to pay the major contract, they generally need to be approving a special levy before they go out to tenders. Otherwise, they're really limited by the number of contractors that will bid on the project, because contractors don't want to spend time on a contract bid process if the Strata Corporation isn't going to approve their levy anyhow. And they can protect themselves by saying that this tender is subject to the approval of the corporation, but that's kind of a catch-22 problem for a strata. One of the benefits that we've seen, and we've certainly seen it already, and it's in such a short time that depreciation reports are up, is that strata corporations are not having to go to a special levy process, and they're not disclosing to the contractors how much money they've approved for this project. We haven't approved $3.2 million to redo the windows, doors, and balconies on the building. We already have the resources in the bank, so we're not having to approve this money. And basically, we're kind of showing our hand publicly about what we're prepared to pay for our contract. It's one of the challenges, and we see a fair amount of variable cost when we have big contracts that are being bid on. So I don't know, any insight for stratas that might be helpful in that sense. It certainly seems to be better when the strata has the money in the bank and they're prepared to go to a tender process because they know they can approve the funds.
Yeah, I think that's the ideal scenario if the money is there, because it allows you to keep your cards hidden, which is obviously critical, and it allows you to enjoy the benefits of a tender process. I mean, the reason folks go with tender, generally speaking, is that you have a greater likelihood of getting the best price out there, because contractors like the security of the tender process. They like knowing that it's a formal process in which everything is going to be on the table in terms of what's required of the process. And they know that if they're not satisfied, there's a grievance process through the courts. So you're likely to get the better price that way. But you're right, the danger is always that if you don't have that money beforehand, you're either going to have to pass a special levy and then go to the market, in which case everybody knows how much money you have available, or you're going to issue a call for bids from people with a clause that says it's subject to financing, and a contractor looking at that may go, well, I don't know that I want to put my best effort into this bid, because they may not even go ahead with this project at all, right?
Right.
And so that's the big risk you face.
It's catch-22 for volunteers who sit on strata councils, that's for sure. You're listening to QauyPacific's Talk About Strata. I'm Tony Giovento, your host, and we'll be back right after these messages.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call on CL 650.